After that digression, I will say I don't like guns at my table just because I don't think it's a good thematic fit for Dungeons and Dragons. And this is coming from a guy who likes to put like vaguely modern stuff in there all the time, like labor disputes, like Canadian accents, all kinds of stuff like that. I just don't think that guns are good for the kind of fantasy milieu that you're creating. I think the moment that you involve sort of traditional guns in an adventure, it stops being Dungeons and Dragons and it starts becoming something else, something like a different game.
Here's my thing. Gunpowder existed, and so did muskets before ball bearings. So, like,
it's not about
ball bearings in high fantasy games. Like, why don't we have guns?
It's not about the historicity of it. It's about the thematics of it. Like, I'm not in this game with elves and dwarves and demons and stuff, so I can shoot guns at them. I'm doing it so I can find creative solutions to problems. I'm doing it so I can create interesting scenarios. And I think it was like it was John Adams who said something like, and I forget the quote, but the crux of it was that the problem with like guns and handguns and things like that is it gives even sort of the smallest shrimp of a person such an outsized idea of their capability and confidence in something that it's like that is really sort of its power of destruction necessary, because the person fueled on that then uses it as a tool to cause that. And I think you see the same thing if you have overpowered weapons in a fantasy setting, because it just becomes sort of an easy button that people can push. And yeah, you can mitigate that with like, okay, well, it's like maybe it's like a flintlock and it has this much of a chance of exploding on you every time you use it. I think that's a good mitigation if you're determined to have a gun in there. But if like we're talking like reliable like guns, I don't think, and I don't mean from episode 1, Josh, because I know you're holding that one back. But having that kind of sort of modern-esque weaponry, even like 19th century, like late 19th century firearms, it's just too modern. And I think it just destroys the spirit of what you're trying to do by playing a fantasy game. Now, if you were playing an Old West game, that would be different because it would be right in line with the spirit of it. So I'm not talking about all tabletop games. If you want to put that in your D20 Modern or Deadlands or something like that, I think that makes perfect sense. I just don't think guns belong in D&D unless you can do something really interesting with them. And maybe like spell slinging is that.
Okay, I have a rebuttal, Brandon.
You don't need to rebut anything because I'm not saying I'm right. I'm saying that's my
yield your time, counselor.
No.
I'm going to mute you. I'm going to kick you out of the stream. I'll do it.
I'm just saying, don't frame it as an argument because I'm just telling you where I stand.
I have a rebuttal.
I'm not saying you're wrong.
Oh my gosh. You know, this is what I get trying to organize a debate with structure. All right. Well, Brandon, you're wrong because your argument is that guns take you out of the experience, right? It is overpowered damage and grants an inflated sense of self for someone who wouldn't actually be able to deal that kind of damage, right? And they're too modern. I think was your third concession.
I want to clarify again. I was not offering an argument. I was offering an opinion.
You sit on your hands and wait until I'm done, Brandon. You don't have to talk every second.
You are mischaracterizing what I've said.
You can rebut when I'm done with my rebuttal. Respect the debate time. I would also argue, Counselor Brandon, that wizards tend to fit right into that same characterization. What is magic missile if not bullets that can actually hit a person every single time, if not homing beacons? What is a fireball if not a giant bazooka that is cast through? Damn it! Do not argue with me in the subtext. Shenanigans. I call shenanigans. I've had this argument too. I've thought about it a lot. I had someone actually come and approach my table and say like, hey, I want to bring a gun to this session. It's like, cool, but there are no rules for that. So anything that we figure out is going to have to be homebrewed, and we're going to have to test it on the fly, because I can't guarantee that you're going to have a good experience with a lot of these rules as they currently exist. But the reason why I permitted it is because I couldn't distinguish the difference between gun mechanics versus a wand of magic missile mechanics. Because at that stage, unless we were getting really into like the type of gun that you were building, or like what century we were targeting, then really the features of a gun is you shoot it and it maybe hits, right? Which is even worse of a chance than magic missile. And I guarantee you that gun is still going to do less damage, especially if it has reload features, which I'll contend is the bane of any gun within any TTRPG.
Because what I was going to say is like, okay, if you want to treat it like a wand of magic missile, that's fine. That's just a reskin. And if you want to say that this gun can only fire this many bullets and then that's it until like a rest period, or it's completely out and it has to be recharged in a special place.
You're obligating downtime for the character to actually make a magazine of bullets.
Yeah, you have to balance it. You have to balance it in some way, whether time or resource or something like that. So yeah, if somebody's coming in and they're like, well, I've got a 6-shooter and I've got a bandolier, or, you know, I've got this magazine, this full magazine or whatever, and it's like a semi-automatic or something like that, I think that's kind of ridiculous for a fantasy game. But if you're basic, because what you're talking about sounds more just like reskinning a gun for something else, because 100% agree with you that you can make the equation that somebody with a gun is just as much of a glass cannon as a wizard. But the thing about the wizard is, like, unless it's a cantrip or something like that, the wizard only has a certain number of bullets before they have to go figure out how to get more bullets, either through a rest or whatever. And if you were looking at sort of the firearms equivalent of a cantrip in that analogy, it would probably be something like beanbags or rubber bullets or something like that. That
improvised weapon damage.
Yeah, like something that's explicitly non-lethal and maybe does like 1d2 damage or something like that.
I will say shooting beanbags or rubber bullets is going to deal a bit more than 1d2 damage.
Again, and here's where we get into an issue again, because, you know, let's think about what the damage on a spell is going to be like, right? Like, you know, like 1d8, you know, fire damage, something like that. How do you scale that for a non-lethal round of ammunition? Like, you almost can't, because there's so much of a difference between that. So that's why I'm saying a beanbag or a rubber bullet would be, you know, 1d2 or something like that, because it has to be comparable to what that like bullet damage would be if we were thinking of it in terms of an offensive spell.
Well, what I was going to say is the rules that I've seen in systems like D&D for gunslingers in high fantasy scenarios are very limited in how much you can do shooting in a given round. Even if you do the thing where you're like, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look like one of those guys that walks into town in an old Western, and like, you've got the like 2 bandoliers with rounds in them, and you've got quick loaders for your revolvers, and you've got a repeater rifle and all this stuff. Like, all of that, every last single one of those items is like, yeah, okay, you have a quick loader, which you can only have like 1 or 2 of those available at a time, and that'll load 6 rounds into a revolver. And the revolver then per bullet only does like 1d8, 2d6, somewhere in there damage. And then you have abilities that let you fire it a little bit more rapidly with a single attack action. And even then it's like, I don't know, man, like this compares reasonably favorably to an archer with +2 arrows of some kind, but not well, particularly, as our friend J.R. Zambrano pointed out in his article, D&D, a pistol is as strong as a greatsword, 5 weird rules about firearms in the Dungeon Master's Guide. The range on a longbow is like 600 feet. Is that right? Or am I shortening that up even? Yeah, it's a 600-foot long range weapon. That's true for flintlock style weapons. Longbows were still outclassing them for distance because the projectiles could be launched up into the air, and provided you didn't have a wind current carrying it back toward you, which is a thing that people had to be concerned about, be glad that your DMs do not sit down and go, all right, Rangers, we'll be calculating wind speed today. You
can't get advantage for a higher elevation attack.
Account for the curvature of the earth.
Oh God!
They'll be wishing for the days you made them track arrows. But like everything you're saying is fine and right and correct. But I want to go back to the foundational point I was making, and that it's guns do not fit thematically into a fantasy setting.
I think
I know that, Brandon. Steampunk is a thing. You can't deny the brass cannons. Like, they're gonna be there.
You know why we call it steampunk? Because it's a distinct genre, separate from, but related to fantasy, and has its own thing. I would say
has its own setting, Brandon.
I would say, talking about longbows and things like that, like the Battle of Agincourt. What weapons did they have there? I would argue any weapon that they had at the Battle of Agincourt is thematically appropriate for a fantasy setting. You show me Henry V like wielding a Mauser or something like that, and then I'll agree with you.
All right. So here's my broader point: is you and I both like Earthshaker, right? Yes. An adventure that is ostensibly about a mecha that comes to town that is Godzilla sized and starts rampaging.
Yeah, it's like the robot from the Intergalactic music video.
Yes. You and I both really like Barrier to the Expedition Peaks, in part because it plays with that like thematicness of high fantasy. Guns make more sense by a long shot than either of those things, or Warforged, or airships by a long stretch.
Objection. So
actually, I want to come in real quick to derail your argument and say that non-lethal damage is actually only relegated to melee attacks. So even the stealthy ranger, even your mage with their magic is generally not going to be able to pull off a non-lethal attack with any kind of ranged spell or damage. So, continue.
As anyone who's been to a protest will tell you, getting shot with beanbag rounds does not feel like non-lethal damage.
So what I was going to say is, getting back to my point.
He remembered.
Is I like Expedition to the Barrier Peaks because and I think the reason it's one of the most popular modules of all time is because it subverts the trope. It actively subverts the trope of high fantasy. And that's because it's a one-off. I think Earthshaker, it actively subverts the trope of high fantasy by introducing this sort of anachronistic thing as a one-off. Now, imagine if you were imagine a campaign setting where every mountain you go to has a UFO buried under it. Spoilers for the 1976.
Wow. I was gonna go play
Barrier Peaks.
Or one of the earliest episodes of GGP, we talk in depth about Expedition of the Barrier Peaks. That's not just spoilers for the 1970s. That's spoilers for GGP 3 years ago.
And with Earthshaker, imagine you're in a campaign setting where every duchy has its own robot, like giant robot. Now, that's pretty fucking cool as an idea. I'll tell you that right now. But that, again, takes us into sort of a different kind of game. And I think it's fine to have a different kind of game. But I don't think the examples you have brought up are close to what we're talking about in terms of guns in an adventure, which is something that would be pervasive throughout the world. Unless there's only one gun and the person who's got that gun is like some sort of god, basically.
That's how they did it on Critical Role. They had the character Percy as the originator of guns in the world. So it was difficult for them to secure the components needed to continue making ammunition, which developed a pretty decent track. Sorry I cut you off there, Jish. Just had to spread the love around.
I accept the spreading of the love,
feels.
particularly knowing that Brandon and I are not particularly tuned into Critical Role details.
Now, I am
what
familiar
was going
with
to
that.
say is-
I am familiar with that though from when I reviewed season 1 of the animated series with
Right.
Gabe.
I will note that you omitted my final 2 examples, Warforged and airships, sir.
Now hold on there, because airships have become part of the fantasy conversation because of games like Final Fantasy.
And Eberron,
Yes, but Eberron
which is
came
a
after Final
steampunk
Fantasy.
setting.
Eberron came after Final Fantasy, so you could argue
Yes.
that it was influenced by that. Warforged, I'm not seeing because the Warforged have a spirit inside them, right? Like, I'm not super familiar with Eberron. Like, what runs them? What do they run on?
They're actually made out of wood, not metal. They're not
there's-
robots.
There's a plant structure that exists within the chassis, so to speak.
So they're like Groots.
Kind of.
So they're not
Fruits that were
robots.
made into a magical army. So they were
Yeah.
they're kind of automatons constructed by one of the houses to win the war.
Yeah.
And then after the war was over, they were just kind of purposeless, which is why some of them developed consciousness. And
I think, first of all, I think Warforged also take you out of it a little bit, unless you're in a specific setting, like an Eberron, that's a steampunkish kind of setting. I think they fit there.
man, the fact that elves only meditate for 4 hours takes me out of it.
Let me finish. But so something
Well,
like
I'm gonna let you finish.
something like Warforged, right? So that's a culture, that's a people that you can build storytelling around, right? And maybe you can tell a cool story about a gun, but guns aren't sentient. Guns aren't like people.
What if
guns
it was?
can't have
What
character
if the
development?
guns were sentient in the world that you made, Brandon? Would that be fantasy enough for you then? If they had a conscience?
Probably. I mean, it would depend on sort of the broader world that's around them as to whether or not it was a fantasy setting. Like, I don't think we're really necessarily disagreeing on anything here. I'm just saying that, like, from my conception of a fantasy setting, guns don't belong there. They don't fit. They don't feel right. And again, I go back to sort of classic medieval weaponry and things like that. That's what I expect to see in a fantasy setting by and large. And I am perfectly fine if there's 1 or 2 sort of outliers going on there. But when you get into a situation where, like, my fantasy town has an ammunition in it or something like that, then I think that's going over the edge a little bit too much.
What about
Josh
a sword gun?
Josh
Are you
is
okay
looking.
with a sword gun?
Final Fantasy VIII is not my favorite game.
Okay, I'm going to say one thing to support your position, Brandon, because here's
Okay.
where I see guns as most problematic. If everybody has a gun, map combat is impossible.
Mhm.
It's just impossible to actually structure a map around it because you're no longer looking at 5 by 5 foot squares, right? You got to increase that distance just
Mhm.
based on the fact that everyone's going to get their firing shot,
Narrow
and once they
cones.
run out of ammo, then they're going to charge, right? So now you're forced to give your enemies guns so that they can have that same
Mhm.
firepower.
Yeah. If we take away all the guns, only criminals will have the guns. But
And our squares are going to become 20 by 20, Brandon. It's going to be ridiculous.
But once they run out of ammo, they're going to do what they did in the old 1950s Superman series. It's like they shoot at Superman, and Superman just stands there and takes the bullets. And then, even though they know exactly who Superman is, for some reason they seem confused after this doesn't work, and then they panic and they just throw the gun at him, hoping that will do some damage where their bullets.
I had to double check something because I was like, when did like muskets first become a thing that was in production? And the answer is even earlier than I thought. The answer is 1521.
Oh my God, we're
I
not
was
back
gonna
on
guess
this.
1600s.
It's not a historicity argument. It's
Isn't
a
it,
thematics
though?
argument.
It kind of is,
You
though.
literally
Like,
went back to an empire and said if they didn't use it here, it shouldn't be appropriate there.
in fairness, Brandon did quote an empire, a specific battle that occurred in 1415. So a full 100 years earlier. But my point is that, like, I don't mind guns being a thing that is kind of a rarity, especially in a world where things like heat metal exist as a spell that can be cast at range on your highly explosive device you carry around in your hand.
Ah, but my gun is 3D printed,
Exactly.
GM.
Exactly. So some wizard has access to Thingiverse.
Oh God. But
I get all of my ammo off the Zons of Am. No worries.
AMN.
there's this specific group living out in a rainforest that manufactures all of them for me.
Listen, Gary, you and I are going to go over your character's backstory after this session and your character sheet. No, you're not going to fight me on it. There have been too many incidents.
I like the idea of guns as a limited item at a table. I don't think, in much the same fashion that we've been talking about already, I don't think it makes sense for them to be a everybody's got one kind of item. Not least of which, much like a well-crafted sword, they were massively expensive back in the day.
Yeah.
So,
well, and then there's the ammunition economy too, because if for a rare weapon, you're not going to be able to go out and find ammo for it. So you're going to be like Bronson in Death Wish 3 sitting there at his dining room table with one of those like gunpowder fillers for bullet casings and stuff. So all your downtime at your bastion is going to have to be spent with you just like pouring little bits of gunpowder in there and then pulling the crank and everything.
That's what we have minions for, Brandon. Minions for making the gun bullets.
Lazon of Am sends me it every 2 weeks.
Subscribe and save on my bullets.
I will say
subscribe and saving throw.
I will say I don't think it's completely a coincidence that the last time I had a player pretend that they forgot that sharpshooter, the added damage comes at the cost of accuracy for your rolls, happened to be someone who was very enthusiastically playing a gunslinger type ranger at my table. So I don't think that was a coincidence. But that doesn't mean, look, if people want to bring guns to my games, not to my tables, to my games, then that's fine. I'm good with that. You bring guns to my tables, I'm mad at you. Leave it in the car.
Like an actual gun.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. IRL guns, not allowed at tables. I agree with both of you for the most part. I think that I would probably limit it in giving an accuracy debuff to any strength-based characters, because if they didn't have dexterity proficiency at minimum, I could see them missing more often. Or unless they had like a soldier background trait or something that would make sense for them to have been familiarized with the mechanics of it, as opposed to just picking it up at a general store and shooting their way through town.
I mean, in fairness to real life, shooting guns without training and expertise is very challenging, and you're more likely to hit the wall around your opponent than you are to hit your opponent. Ask me about my time playing with airsoft guns as a kid. But the thing I would add to that is that the rules, as I understand it, are already, this is a dexterity-based weapon. You need to have proficiency in this weapon to get good accuracy with it. Otherwise, you're doing the same thing as you would if you were like, oh, I may not be a martial weapons character, but I really want to throw a scythe around. Like, yeah, sure, you can do that. It's not going to be great for you, but yeah, okay, sure.
I'm kind of hit or miss on the Call of Cthulhu rules for this, but I think I like it more than I hate it. And their argument was that the point blank mechanics should decrease all hope of accuracy with the gun. If you're standing next to someone and they're 6 feet away, your chance of hitting them within that 6 feet is pretty limited, considering they can dodge out of the way pretty easily.
Yeah.
There's some assumptions to unpack there. Like if I had a gun pointed to your chest, that would surely not miss, right? You know, like there's an argument to be made that distance doesn't necessarily invalidate the damage output of a gun the closer it is. Unless it's, well, shotguns. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is like there is some kind of compelled disadvantage to using a gun in close fighting. And that's the kind of like rules that I would probably want to look forward to curtail this from being exploited mid-battle. Or if they are exploiting it, they have a pretty good heckin' story as to why they're exploiting it. And then I shoot them in the back or something like that. Dramatic. Win me with cinematography.
Oh my God, he's turning it sideways.
Oh no.
I know we had like other topics here on this podcast, but
but we're not going to get to
we
them.
spent a long time talking about guns. So
I'm gonna clip out this gun debate as its own YouTube video.
how about we cap our convo here with our take on guns? At the table, not at the table, final remarks, and then we can close this argument for now.
I don't want players bringing a gun to the game, or I don't want characters in the game to have a gun. I think if there's a gun-like weapon that's in the game and the characters through a bunch of struggle manage to acquire it and then figure out how to like create ammo for it and stuff like that, I think that's fair as long as it's like a super rare item. But just the idea that everybody's packing, I think, takes a lot of the magic out of it for me.
All right. Okay. Josh?
I support firearm legislation. I think it should be limited, whether in the hands of gnomes, dwarves, elves, or otherwise. You know, it's a matter of it should only be in specific hands at specific times. I don't think I'm quite to the level of Brandon where it's like it needs to be a super rare item, but I think it is a situation where, because wizards can cast heat metal on your explosive device, a lot of people are like, yeah, I don't mess with those things because I knew a guy who messed with those things and he pissed off a lich and the lich blew it up and it exploded in his hands. He doesn't have hands anymore. Like that, I think that's more the way I would handle that. Part of it is a rarity thing because yes, they are expensive. Yes, the ammo is hard to acquire. But a lot of it is just there's not a huge market for it because people are like, yeah, I don't listen, buddy. The guys who are down in the mines, they work with high explosives. Me walking around with tiny high explosives on my back, not a thing I'm about. Thanks.
And I appreciate everyone's fun. If I'm going to include lightsabers, I'm going to include guns, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to torture you for your particular brand of it. So,
what about a lightsaber gun?
What about a lightsaber gun?
Yeah.
You got stats for that? Or are we making it at the table?
Josh is about to whip out something from the Fantasy Flight Star Wars game and be like, well, actually, that exists. And it requires a 30 dice pool to fire it.
No, because in the Star Wars Fantasy Flight games, I presume they use the same rules as Star Wars in general does, where you're not shooting lasers, you're shooting condensed tubes of plasma out of your various pistols and things like that. So it's slightly different.
40K probably has some examples for you, Brandon, though.
40K probably does have that, yes.
Yeah. Well, I don't have thousands of dollars to spend on figs, so I will not be investigating 40K.
The D20 system can be played on any tabletop, Brandon. And they'll have phaser stats in there for you, so you can look at how other people have done.
I have a feeling if I try to touch anything 40K and I come with no minis, I'm just going to get made fun of.
I don't think
Brandon,
that's
I'll run you a D20 game of 40K. You don't need an army, bro. You just need a character and a desire to conquer the rest of the universe for the Empire.
You and me and Henry Cavill, we can all get together and play 40K.
You lied, but that's going to happen now that you said it.
He doesn't have much going on right now. That should be fine. Unless he gets that James Bond role.
Well, did we want to talk about White Wolf now, or we
No,
could save it for
absolutely
a
not.
deep dive?
It is an hour, past an hour of recording. We should wrap this episode up. We have so much content, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Because
players,
we did not anticipate.
I hope
arguing.
you enjoyed tuning in and you expected to hear some RPG news, and you instead walked away with a very in-depth discussion on the finer points of gun mechanic management in your TTRPG table.
Well, now hold on. We
no,
shared some RPG
hold
news
on.
Because, like, the whole talking about the third-party publishers releasing Mage Hand, our buddies at Mage Hand Press put out the Gunslinger pack.
You're right. We did start with
that.
some news that we then tangented into for about approximately 45 minutes.
We're fun slingers around here.
Personally, I kind of enjoyed running this debate format. So if you guys want to debate other contentious TTRPG topics, I encourage you all to send us ideas and insights to our Discord, because that's the only thing we check. I asked you to put things on YouTube. That was unreliable of me in the past. I am sorry. I apologize to you. I did not know Brandon would forget to put the YouTube videos up. And so all of my
forgot. It's not that I forgot. I've had a lot going on, man.
I did not know that Brandon wouldn't care enough to put up the YouTube videos. And for that, I'm sorry. That was my failing.
I didn't know that Brandon would be close to a breakdown if he had one more thing he had to do this week.
I kid, Brandon. Thank you for doing everything that you do.
I will say, the big problem we've had in the past with people bringing us contentious topics is that for 90% of them, Brandon and I both are like, that sucks. Yeah, I agree. That does suck.
Oh my God, then I'll play the part that wants to disagree with you. I don't even have to think that it's true. I'll just argue against you.
Before we tangent ourselves into a whole other discussion, I do want to say, just let everybody know, looking forward to the next episode. This shouldn't be contentious at all, but we're going to review the new Dragon Delves anthology that's coming out in July. We'll be reviewing that on the episode that comes out on somebody help me out with the calendar.
I think it's the 30th?
2 weeks from now.
Yeah, the episode that comes out the 30th. We'll have a review of that, which is sort of what's now become their annual anthology adventure book. Because I think
got so many dragons. They got an adventure for each dragon.
Yeah, this is the third or fourth year they've released an anthology book, and this is like the second or third year in a row that they've released a dragon book, which I guess for a property called Dungeons and Dragons, that's not unexpected, but it seems to me that to balance things out, they need to release a couple of dungeon focused books.
Honestly, one could get into that if they found the beautiful world of romantasy literature, because after just reading Fourth Wing, I know the dragons are real hot right now. We should write some stuff.
That's so hot right now.
Hot in multiple ways.
Yeah,
it'll be a different kind of dungeon dragon adventure.
It'll be Dragons in Dungeons.
Thank you, Dragon.